Pat Tillman's death on a battlefield in Afghanistan became an emblem for this country's response, both personal and military, to the September 11th attacks. Tillman was a pro football star who walked away from a multi-million-dollar contract to join the Army Rangers and became arguably America's most famous soldier. April 2004, Corporal Tillman died during his second tour in Afghanistan, killed by friendly fire, though the military covered up that fact, opting instead to fabricate a story of a heroic death while fighting the enemy. The broad outlines of Pat Tillman's story may be familiar, but a new documentary, The Tillman Story, provides fascinating new details about his life and death. Joining us now is Amir Bar-Lev, the director of The Tillman Story, opening this week in New York and Los Angeles. Amir, thanks so much for coming to talk to us.
Thanks for having me.
I guess I wonder, first of all, what don't people know about this story? I mean, I think the broad outlines of it are kind of familiar because it got a lot of press, but have then kind of receded. What were you surprised by working on this? What do you think people don't know about the story?
I was surprised at how far off the mark people's perception of this story is to begin with. I mean, I think there's a sense that this is a story that is over, that this is something, you know, that we look back on about the Bush administration. In fact, this is a story that continues to this day. Nobody's ever really been called to account for their actions. And even yesterday, there was a new chapter in the story where the military issued a press statement with a further lie. They said, we are deeply apologetic to the Tillman family for mistakes made. And this word mistake is itself part of this conspiracy. There was never a mistake. A mistake would be if I, knocked over my water here. This was a deliberate attempt to cover up the facts for which nobody has ever taken credit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that becomes clear in the film is that the preposterous story that was told about his death, really, was so far from what actually happened that it couldn't be a mistake. It had to be fabricated. How high up does that go?
Well, it looks like it went all the way to the White House. And, but what happened was they made an error. They underestimated Pat's mother, Danny Tillman. And they handed over 3,500 documents pertaining to his death. And from this little cottage up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, she painstakingly, over years' time, unredacted these documents. And what's in there, I think, is going to shock people when they see it. I mean, there's no question as to whether or not this was a mistake. There's documents in there that say things like the Tillman game plan. At the highest levels, there's emails from the White House talking about how they were going to manage this story to deceive the American public.
The Tillman story was one of a few stories from that time. There was Private Lynch and her rescue that was portrayed in these kind of crazy, cartoonish ways. I wonder what kind of perspective you gained about that time in American history when there was this really intense sort of jingoistic fervor that gripped the country and this real kind of collective desire for mythos that Pat Tillman became sort of wrapped up in. What did you learn about that period?
Well, I don't know that period is over. I mean, I think it says a lot about our culture, and I think it's too easy to point the finger only at the Bush administration. I mean, you mentioned Jessica Lynch. Pat Tillman was involved in that operation, and he, from the wings, he said, this is a movie. They're basically constructing a movie. And the sad tragedy of it all is, we didn't get, there's some shocking footage from the Jessica Lynch operation in our film that people haven't seen. We didn't get handed that footage in some garage by some deep throat in a paper bag. We got it from the mainstream press. The reason folks haven't seen it is because the mainstream press chose to omit that, chose to leave it on the editing room floor so they could construct this idea of a female Rambo from the mountains of West Virginia. This mythos works because this is we want to see our movies played out in the news, and I think it's a story about the government. It's also a story about the press, and it's also a Hollywood story.
You basically say in the film that there is sort of, it's a story about a story. It's a story about the myth of Pat Tillman. It's a story about the story of Pat Tillman. What did you learn about the actual flesh and blood, human being, son, husband that was Pat Tillman?
Well, we worked on the film for 3 years, and it was a tremendous opportunity to spend time with this very, very unique family. They're irascible. They're prone to F-bombs. We just got an R rating because of it. And, I think people are also going to be surprised to see that this is a somewhat uplifting story, even despite its tragedy. But Pat, Pat was a guy with strong opinions who was absolutely willing to change those opinions. That's what's not known about him. He's been turned into this square-jawed guy with a one-track mind, when in fact, you know, he was a committed guy, a loyal guy, a patriotic guy, but he was a guy who was willing to see things from different points of view, willing to question his own beliefs. He was a guy who changed his beliefs once he saw what was going on after his first deployment, and he was involved with that Jessica Lynch operation. He was a guy who, in an earlier time, some people would have called a flip-flopper.
Amir Bar-Lev, he is the director of the Pat Tillman story. It's a wonderful film. It's opening, if I'm not mistaken, New York, Los Angeles this weekend. Am I right?
That's right.
Great.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure.
Okay.